We talk a lot about being a disciple. If you had to define disciple, what do you think a disciple is? I worked on that a little bit this week, and this is what I came up with. A disciple is someone who admires someone else and tries to become like them. Someone who admires somebody else, the way that they live their lives, the way that they think, the way that they do stuff, and tries to be like them. So if that's anywhere in the ballpark, look at who you are most like. So take a look at the way you think. Take a look at the things you think. Take a look, probably more importantly, at the things that you do. And when you look at those things, that'll probably give you a pretty good idea of whose disciple you are. So you can be a disciple of Jesus, or Warren Buffett, or Sean Hannity, or Oprah, or Mr. Beast, or Kylie Jenner, or Adam Smith, or you can even be a disciple of your crazy Aunt Martha if you really want to. And obviously, we think becoming like Jesus is the way to go. In fact, we think that's so important that it is the second of our organizing principles. Our first organizing principle is that we reach people for Christ. Secondly, we develop disciples who make disciples. And third, we live lives of compassion, mercy, and justice. So becoming a disciple who makes disciples is important to us. And as I was thinking about this sermon today and thinking about discipleship, I could just give you a list of what disciples do. And we could unpack that list. We could talk about reading your Bible. We could talk about the need to learn how to pray. We could talk about the need for accountability of going through life with other people, about how you should join a small group. We could talk about how every day you should just make a whole series of Jesus-y choices. We could do all of that. And Jesus has a really good suggestion about how to do discipleship. He says in Mark chapter 8:34, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it." And so I could do any of those things, but honestly, as I thought about it, I thought we talk about that stuff most every week. And people really are doing those things. And as people do those things, they're producing results. The more people get into Scripture, the more God's Word is in them, the better choices that they make, the more they connect in prayer, the more peace and joy they experience in their lives. The more Jesus-y choices they make, the easier it becomes to be more like Jesus. People are growing in their faith by being involved in small groups. All of those things are happening. And people are learning to give up their prerogatives and their priorities and to trust Jesus, and they're finding real life there. And most of us are more like Jesus this year than we were last year. I say most of us because I'm just going to let you sort yourselves out. But today, as I thought about all those things that we could talk about, I was really looking for something more foundational than that. Maybe something that we don't talk about as often, and maybe even just another way to look at it. Because sometimes I find that when there's a subject that we talk about a lot, if I take a look at it from a different angle, it opens up some new understanding for me. And so here is the way that I want to look at it this morning. The key to discipleship is to really believe what you've already heard or you already know. The key to discipleship is to really believe what you've already heard or what you already know. Now, I want to give a huge shout out to Dallas Willard, because these thoughts and my whole life actually has been heavily influenced by Dallas Willard, who is one of my seminary professors. And this sermon in particular has a lot of stuff from his writings in The Divine Conspiracy and The Cost of Discipleship, and I highly recommend both of those books to you. So a lot of this really comes from wrestling with Dallas Willard. And the verse that I want to take you to that encapsulates this idea is Mark chapter 9, verse 24, which says, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." Now, let me put that into context for you so that it makes some sense, and then we'll talk about that. So the picture comes out of Mark chapter 9, and the transfiguration has just occurred. Big deal. If you don't know what that is, Jesus is changed into like his heavenly body form, and the disciples get a glimpse of what God is really doing, and then they come down from the mountain, and this happens. Verse 17, a man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son, who's possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." "You unbelieving generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It's often thrown him into the fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." "If you can," said Jesus. "Everything is possible for one who believes." Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." So the salvation in this story is that the father knows that he has a decision to make. His faith, whatever faith that the father has gotten him into the vicinity of Jesus. So he's got enough faith to know that getting his son, that getting himself to Jesus is probably a good thing. So he's got enough faith, he's got enough belief to do that. And now he's got to decide whether he really believes or not. And in this story, the guy is really driven by desperation. And that's okay. Sometimes we have to get to an extreme situation before we get the clarity that we need. Sometimes in everyday life, we've got so much going on, we can't really see clearly, but put us in a really difficult situation, and all of a sudden life becomes very clear about what's important, about what we need to do. And we give God a much more free hand when we get to the place where we feel, I don't have any place else to go. Then it's really easy to turn to God, and God is always faithful. But the guy could have said, I gave this a shot. I brought my kid to you, I brought him to your disciples, and it didn't work. Now, I'm going to take just a moment to pick up on a minor point in the story and just step aside for a second. So he brings his kid. Jesus is not there. He's up on the Mountain of Transfiguration. And so this guy brings his son to Jesus' disciples, the next best thing. Kind of like us. Jesus is away, so we're kind of Jesus' representative. So the father who has this need, his kid is just in a horrible place that I can't even imagine as a parent, brings him, and they can't do anything. And what I want to remind us is that people are fallible, and people don't always do what we hope that they will do, even well-intentioned religious people. The disciples couldn't do what he asked. And so it'd be really easy for him to go, those people failed me. And maybe you feel like that too in some of the interactions that you have had with the church or with the people of God or Christians or people who call themselves. Maybe you hoped for something and people failed you miserably. I always say, any terrible story, any horrific story you have about the church, come talk to me because I've got one that's worse. So I'm sure that you have been disappointed by people. I'm sure that you have been hurt by the church in the past. But the church and the people and the disciples are not Jesus. And sometimes I think, there's pain, and what we need to do is figure out a way that we can forgive and move past that by the grace of God. Most of the time, we just need to grant charitable assumptions and believe that they were trying. But what we really need to make sure, like with this guy, is that we don't let the people that have failed us, even the people who say that they speak for God or who are, sounding like they're as close to Jesus as possible gets, we can't let them stop us from following Jesus himself or to drive us away from the church, because there's no discipleship outside of the church. You can feel Jesus-y out wandering around the trees climbing on Mount Rainier. You can do that. But if you're not tied to a community, it's not really following Jesus. You might disagree with me, but you're wrong. So, but the thing to remember is that Jesus is the healer. Jesus is the one that changes people's life. Most of the rest of us or just doing our best to adequately represent him. And sometimes we fail. Okay, stepping back into the story. So he could have just taken his son and went home. Instead, he takes the faith that he has. He's got enough faith to get him close to Jesus. He takes the faith that he has, and I love this line. I mean, this is one of the lines that reminds me that the Bible is real, because nobody would make this stuff up. He says to Jesus, okay, if you can do something, I'm down. And I love Jesus' response, if I can. And sometimes it sort of betrays a little bit of Jesus' humor there, but I also love that there is a graciousness about it. You know, because Jesus could just go, nuts to you. I mean, how much more do I need to do to prove that I can do stuff you do? And you're like, if you can. But Jesus doesn't leave. He just kind of tosses us back. I can. Do you want me to? You know, and sometimes I think we just need to remember that. You know, that we have these situations in our lives, and we kind of approach Jesus with, well, I'll toss it to you to see what you can do with that. And Jesus is like, if I can do something with it? Everything is possible for one who believes, and that's the crisis point in this story. And that's the crisis point for us, because that's where this guy has to take what he's heard, he has to take what he's known, and he has to decide whether he really believes that. Because the things that you really believe are the things that you do. If you don't do them, if it doesn't change your actions, you don't really believe them. And that's the biggest challenge of discipleship, is to take what we have heard and what we know and move it to the point where we actually believe it. The guy says, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. And I think that's the foundation of discipleship. Okay, Jesus, I'll trust you with my son. I want to be the person who believes. I'm struggling with all this. I don't have this all figured out. But I'll trust that you can heal my son. I'll take what I know about you and I'll act on that. When we think about discipleship, we think about knowing more stuff. Discipleship is growing in your knowledge. I'm not so sure. I think discipleship is more about taking what we already know and what we've heard and actually believing it enough to actually act on it. That's the core of discipleship. If you get that down, to really believe the stuff that you've heard, the stuff that you know, I think the rest will fall into place. Most of us, not all of us, I mean, some of you are brand new to this, some of you are just checking this stuff out, so this doesn't really apply to you, but most of us have an immense amount of information about God. Most of us know what we ought to do. The question is, do we really believe it enough to do it? I remember years ago, I was talking to one of the leaders in the church, and he was super frustrated. And he's like, everybody just keeps saying, we need more Bible studies. We need more Bible studies. We need more Bible studies. And he was like, I think Bible study is great, but to what end? And that's really the question. You know, please study the Bible. Please read the Bible. I'm reading it through in the year, but to what end? To just grab more knowledge that doesn't affect you? That's pointless. If we're going to study the Bible, it's so that it begins to change our actions to that end. Generally, we have the right answers, but to have all the right answers and to believe the right answers are two different things. In believing, we actually live as if something was really true. So let's take a couple of examples. Like, what do we know about Jesus? What have we heard about Jesus? So I could take audience response here, but I had a little bit of time to think about this week. So one of the things, one of my go-to core beliefs about Jesus, about God, is that I believe that Jesus will never leave me or forsake me. That comes out of Hebrews chapter 13:5, but it's all the way through the Old Testament. Someday I'll tell you all about it. That's fundamental to me. When I think about who Jesus is, he's the person that promises he'll never leave me and he'll never forsake me. On August 5th, we could pick any number of dates, but on August 5th, the stock market took a pretty big hit. The NASDAQ and the Dow both lost between 2 and 3% of their value. Some individual stocks lost as much as 5% of their value that day. I mean, it bounced back. But so it was a pretty big day, pretty bad day for the stock market. And one of my friends was out with another buddy, and they were talking about what had happened in the stock market that day. And this other guy said, I lost $700,000 today. And then he started to laugh because he realized how ridiculous it was to complain about losing $700,000 when $700,000 represented 5% of his stock portfolio. So, maybe you didn't lose $700,000 that day, but did you panic? When you saw the financial news, did you get a deep pit in your stomach? Did you wonder how this was going to affect your lifestyle and your plans? Did you call your broker in a panic? Or did you go, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I believe that God will take care of me because he promised to. Jesus says he will never leave me or forsake me. Which did you do? Because it's really easy to believe that God will take care of you until you take a financial hit. Especially in Gig Harbor because everybody thinks they're running out of money. But that's when you find out how real your relationship to Jesus is. It's really easy to say, Jesus will never leave me or forsake me. It's harder if you lose $700,000, 5% of your income on one day. All right, how about something else? I believe, this is why I do what I do. I believe Jesus has a purpose for my life. I believe Jesus has a purpose for your life. When I was in high school, some of my closest friends, I grew up in LA, and my closest friends' parents worked for the studios. And they worked below the line. They weren't on screen. They did other things around. They did really well for themselves. They both had great careers. They were raising 4 kids. They were serious Christians. And one day, they felt called to move to Papua New Guinea to be Wycliffe Bible translators. All of their friends thought that they were crazy. I think they were crazy. But they went ahead and they did it. They gave up their lucrative careers. They gave up, the surety of the educational system. They moved to Papua New Guinea, and they were there for probably 10 years. And it was life-transforming for the kids. It was life-transforming for them. And nobody regrets it that they ever did. They came back and they retired well. They didn't live in tents or eat cat food. They were fine. I talk about that occasionally with people. And people get really wistful a lot of the times. People will go, yeah, I wish I could do that. But now is not a good time with my career. Oh, man, I wish I had that kind of faith. But, my kids just got settled, And I keep laughing because Howard and Donna were like, yeah, we're at a good point in our career. Yeah, our kids are settled, but, the kids will probably rebound and we'll be fine because they believed Jesus has a purpose for their lives. I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief. Now, those are all hard things, and I picked them intentionally that way. There are other easier things that we could all go, oh yeah, totally down with that. Those are hard. But one of the things this is my big quote from Dallas Willard today, because this is what I'm thinking about. What's the other option if we choose not to believe where it affects our action? Willard says this, the cost of non-discipleship is far greater, even when this life alone is considered, than the price to walk with Jesus. Non-discipleship costs abiding peace, a life penetrated throughout by love, faith that sees everything in the light of God's overriding governance for good, helpfulness that stands firm in the most discouraging of circumstance, power to do what is right and withstand the forces of evil. In short, it costs exactly the abundance of life Jesus said he came to bring in John 10:10. We look at following Jesus as if it's going to be really, really hard, and it is. But Willard's point is it's harder to not follow Jesus. Our life will be less fulfilled. So that's why it's important. That's why we believe in becoming disciples. That's why we develop disciples who make disciples. And the way we look at that is that our first emphasis is on us. It's making sure that we are becoming disciples, that we are following Jesus and believing what he said to the point that our lives are being changed. And then, as we are on that path, we invite people to come on the path with us, to become disciples. Yes, as people want to just come to church, you need to belong before you believe in many cases. Absolutely come be wherever you are on the continuum of faith. But ultimately, what we want is for people to know Jesus and to know him in a life-changing way. And that sounds like, well, duh, isn't that what the church is for? Except that that's not always what happens. Because sometimes all the church requires of you is that you belong to the right political party, or that you're in the right socioeconomic bracket, or that your family has belonged to the place for years. But we're committed to becoming disciples. We're not a social club. We're not a service club. We're a church. And we may do a lot of the same things. In fact, at our retreat yesterday with the leadership team and the pastors, we talked about the ways that we are impacting the community, the way that we are changing people's lives. We do a lot of the things that service clubs do, but we do it because we're motivated by the love of Jesus. We're fundamentally different in that way. When you look at my job, I am not the cruise director. My job description isn't make everyone happy all of the time and make sure they have fun things to do. I'm the pastor. My job description is to help you become more like Jesus. And then once we begin to do those things, we're committed to discipling the people that Jesus does bring to us. And this kind of gets us to the practical ways that we do this. And this is where we do get into some of the things that I talked about in the beginning. I mean, how do you become a disciple? How do you learn to trust Jesus? Well, get into the Bible. Figure out how to pray. Join a small group. But honestly, this is going to sound like a commercial, but it really isn't, because I believe in this so strongly. The best way that I know to grow in discipleship has been encapsulated in our 3-2-1 program, because it is all about relationships. It's about pouring into people's lives and have people pour into our lives. And the 3-2-1 ties in nicely to the cards that we filled out last week about 6 people that we wanted to become aware of, and 3 people that we were going to pray for. And if you didn't have a chance to do that last week, there are those papers out in the gathering place, and you can grab one, and you can help to focus on people. But 3, we began to think about 3 people we could pray for. The 3 in that refers to 3 people in your life who don't know Jesus yet. And the idea with that is just to begin to pray for them, to be open to how God might bring an opening in their lives for you to begin to have a spiritual conversation. So pray for people. Pray for 3 people that you come into contact with that you know would be different if they knew Jesus. The 2 is 2 people who already have a relationship to Jesus that you can help them grow in their relationship. If you've got kids, you've got 2s. If you've got other people that you can bring along, you can do that intentionally. And sometimes that's a formal discipleship relationship, but oftentimes, it's an opportunity to just kick things to a deeper level with some of the relationships that you already have with people who are following Jesus. So you've got a couple of buddies. That's great. When you get together, absolutely cover the weather. Begin to talk about the Seahawks and how their season is going to go. But ask a deep question occasionally. Occasionally, bring up Jesus. Occasionally, ask how people are growing. And that's the way that you begin to develop a relationship where you can help pour into somebody else's life. And then the 1 is someone who intentionally helps you grow in your relationship to Jesus. It's one person who's kind of pouring into you, helping you become more like Jesus. And I've said it 100 million times, and I'll say it again. The people whose lives I see who go off the rails are the people who don't have anyone who knows them very well. The people who have the people who have people who know them deeply, those people tend to be able to hold it together. It's really, really important to have those relationships. So just commend those to you as a way to begin your discipleship and to grow in your discipleship and help other people. And maybe you look at it and you go, wow, that sounds like it's going to take a lot of time. But no, it really doesn't. And the reality is that you have the time if you want to do this. I did this morning, and I do this most days. If I take my iPhone and I hold it up to the lock screen, and if I swipe left from my home screen, it tells me how much time I have spent on my phone that day. Do that. And then add up how much time you have spent in front of a screen. It'll also give you a weekly or monthly average. Look at the average. How much time have you spent in front of a screen? How much time have you spent watching the news channel of your choice, scrolling, whatever? Add those up, and you might be astounded. I mean, I checked this morning at 7 o'clock. I had already spent 22 minutes on my phone. You have more time available than you think. You just have to decide what you're going to do with it. And ultimately, that's going to betray whose disciple you want to be. So let me ask you 3 questions. Number 1, what do you have a hard time trusting God about? Number 2, what are you doing that's helping you grow as a disciple? And number 3, what's one area where you need to grow as a disciple?
Hi, thanks for watching. The people of Harbor Covenant Church really want you to know the love that God has for you, want to grow with you in faith, and want to serve alongside you, not only to help others do the same, but also to make our families and our communities better. If that sounds like something that you can get on board with, then like, follow, and drop us a comment in the video. Watch some more videos on our channel or come visit us on Sunday. You can find out more about Harbor Covenant Church at harborcov.church.